I raised him with my hand shaking and my heart full. He banned me with one sentence and a polite smile. This is the day I stopped begging to be his mother. I'm 76 years old now, and people think that means I forget things. But the truth is I remember too much. I remember the weight of my son when he was first placed in my arms. Red and angry at the world, the way I whispered his name, Elia. Because it sounded like light. Because I wanted his life to be brighter than mine ever was. And for years, it was just the two of us in a narrow apartment that smelled of boiled tea and laundry soap. Me working nights and mornings, my back bending before my spirit ever did, telling myself that if love were a currency, my child would never be poor, and maybe that's where I failed, because I paid for everything with love and forgot to charge him respect. But I didn't know that then. I only knew how to wake up before sunrise, pack lunches with notes folded small like secrets, clap the loudest at school plays even when he forgot his lines, and stand outside in the cold waiting for buses that were always late. And when his father left, not with a goodbye but with a silence so thick it felt like betrayal, I taught Elia to call absence distance and cruelty misunderstanding, because I thought protecting his heart mattered more than telling the truth. And maybe that life followed us all the way here, to the day he looked at me like I was a problem he didn't know how to solve. I remember the first time I noticed it, how he started correcting the way I spoke in public, how his eyes scanned rooms before acknowledging me, how his hugs became lighter, shorter, like obligations instead of instincts. But I told myself it was just growing up, just ambition, just the world pulling him faster than I could keep up. And when I got sick, when my body began betraying me in quiet humiliations, hair thinning, hands trembling, breath coming shorter than it should, I told no one at first, not even him, because mothers learn early that pain is easiest when it belongs only to you. But the treatments showed themselves anyway. In scarves and slow steps, in cancelled plans and pale mornings. And still I believed, foolishly, that when his wedding came, when he stood at the centre of his life's happiness, there would be a chair somewhere with my name on it. Not for attention, not for honour, just for presence. Because I am his mother, and I thought that still meant something. The day he told me I wasn't welcome was strangely ordinary. The sky dull, the kettle already cold on the stove. He sat across from me, Elia, tall and polished now, smelling like expensive cologne and impatience, tapping his fingers like time itself bored him, and he said it carefully, the way people do when they think softness makes cruelty acceptable. Mum, the wedding is very curated, he said, smiling a smile that never reached his eyes. It's small, modern, very visual, and I laughed, because sometimes laughter is what you do when the words don't make sense yet. And I said, of course it is, all weddings are, but he didn't laugh back. He adjusted his jacket and looked past me. Not at me, past me. Like I was furniture he had already decided to replace. And that's when he said it. It might be better if you don't come. And the room went quiet in a way that felt physical. Pressing against my chest, I asked him why, even though my heart already knew. And he spoke about comfort, about guests, about how my health might distract from the day. And then he said the word that changed everything. He said, aesthetic, as if love could clash with color palettes. And I sat there nodding while something inside me slowly folded. Because when your own child looks at you and sees a liability instead of a lifetime, the pain doesn't explode. It settles, heavy and final. And when Morabel, his fiancée, walked in without knocking, heels clicking like punctuation marks, she didn't greet me, didn't look me in the eyes. She just glanced around my home like it offended her, and said, we just want the day to feel clean. And I understood then that clean meant me erased. I told them I would sit quietly, that I didn't need photos or introductions, that I would be invisible if that's what it took. And Morabel smiled the kind of smile you give a decision that's already been made, and said, we don't think that's best. And then she said something about care options, about recovery spaces, about places that could handle someone like me. And I realized she wasn't talking about the wedding anymore. She was talking about removing me entirely. And Elliot didn't stop her. He watched the floor, silent. And that silence told me more than words ever could. I didn't cry in front of them. I didn't argue. I didn't remind him of the nights I held him through fevers or the years I skipped meals so he could eat better. I just nodded and said, I understand, because dignity is sometimes the last thing you're allowed to keep. And when they left, the house felt hollow, not empty, hollow, like something had been taken out and not replaced. I stood at the window and watched their car disappear, and I whispered thank you to no one. Because clarity is a strange gift. It hurts, but it's honest. That night, I sat alone with my thoughts, and for the first time, I didn't imagine his future with me in it. I imagined mine without him, and that's when I remembered the folder. The one hidden beneath years of paperwork, the one no one knew about. Not because I was secretive, but because I never needed anyone to know. Inside it were the quiet results of a lifetime of discipline. Small investments, properties bought when no one was looking. Savings built dollar by dollar while everyone assumed I had nothing. I never lived richly, but I lived intentionally. And everything in that folder had one name written on it, his. Because I thought legacy was something you handed down automatically. But that night, as the kettle cooled and the walls listened, I realized legacy is earned even by children, especially by children. And with shaking hands I took out the will I had written years ago, the one that left everything to Elliot because he was my only son, my only future, and I stared at his name until it no longer felt familiar, until it looked like a stranger's, and I didn't tear it yet, not then, because I needed time to grieve the boy I raised before I could face the man he became. I went to bed knowing something had shifted, knowing that love had finally met its limit. And as I lay there in the dark, breath shallow but steady, I made myself a promise I had never made before. Not to punish him, not to embarrass him, not to seek revenge, but to stop sacrificing myself for someone who had already decided I was expendable. And that promise felt heavier than any anger, heavier than illness, heavier than fear. Because once a mother chooses herself, there is no going back. I thought banning me from the wedding was the cruelest thing my son could do. I hadn't even opened the folder yet, and what I decided next would change everything. I didn't touch the folder for 3 days after Elliot told me not to come to his wedding. 3 ordinary days where the sun still rose and set as if nothing inside me had collapsed. Days where I washed the same cup twice because my hands forgot what they were doing. Where I caught myself setting to plates at the table and then quietly putting one back. And people think heartbreak announces itself loudly, but most of the time it arrives like dust, settling slowly until everything feels heavier than it should. And during those days, I remembered small things. Things that don't make speeches, but build a life. Like how Elliot used to sleep with his shoes on as a child because he said it made him ready for emergencies. Or how he cried the first time I couldn't afford the backpack he wanted and hugged me instead of being angry, telling me it was okay, that we could get it later. And I wondered where that boy went, at what point love turned into inconvenience. Because mothers don't stop loving when children grow older. They just love quieter, with less expectation. And maybe that was my mistake, expecting it all. On the 4th morning, I woke up before dawn, my body aching in that familiar way that illness teaches you to accept. And I made tea and sat at the kitchen table while the house held its breath. And I opened the folder, not dramatically, not with anger, but the way you open a photo album you already know will hurt. Inside were documents that represented years of discipline no one ever praised me for. A small apartment I had rented out long ago. To modest properties bought when interest rates were low and hope was high. Savings accounts I fed quietly while wearing old shoes and declining vacations. Everything written neatly, responsibly, my name steady across every page. And at the bottom of it all, the will, dated years back. My signature confident then, Elia listed as the sole beneficiary because of course he was. Because who else would it be? I remember signing it and feeling relief. Like no matter how lonely the world got, my work would land somewhere safe. But that morning the paper felt different. Not wrong, just unfinished. Like a sentence that no longer matched the story. I didn't tear it yet. Instead, I folded it and placed it back. Because changing something so final deserves thought, not impulse, and that's when I called Rhea Calder. My oldest friend, the one person who knew my silences as well as my words. She answered on the second ring, voice warm and familiar. And before she could ask how I was, I said, "He doesn't want me at the wedding." And there was a pause long enough to feel respected, not pitied. Rhea didn't rush to comfort me. She just said, "Do you want to tell me what happened? Or do you want me to listen?" And I said, "Listen." And so I told her everything. About aesthetics and discomfort and being quietly suggested out of existence. And when I finished, there were tears on my face I didn't remember inviting. And Rhea's voice hardened in a way that only love can manage. She said, "You don't disappear because someone else wants a prettier picture." And I laughed softly because it was the first time someone had said something that made sense. She reminded me of things I had forgotten, of who I was before motherhood swallowed my identity whole, of the woman who worked 2 jobs without complaint, who learned contracts and numbers late at night so no one could cheat her, who taught herself resilience long before it became a quote people posted online. And she asked me a question that stayed with me long after the call ended. She said, "If he weren't your son, would you reward this behavior?" And the answer came faster than I expected. No, I wouldn't. And that answer scared me because it meant blood alone wasn't enough anymore. That afternoon, I went for a slow walk. My scarf wrapped tight, the neighborhood unchanged. And I noticed things I had ignored for years. The way people avoided looking at me once they sensed fragility. The way kindness sometimes came with pity attached. And I realized something quietly devastating. I had been shrinking myself long before Elia asked me to. Making myself smaller so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. Apologizing for space I had every right to occupy. And that night, alone again, I took the will out and read it line by line. Not with anger, but with clarity. I imagined Elia receiving everything without question, accepting it as owed, and something in me resisted. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted truth. And the truth was that inheritance is not payment for biology. It is recognition of relationship, and ours had broken somewhere along the way. The next morning I called Rhea again. Not as a friend this time, but as a lawyer, and when she answered, I said, "I want to rewrite my will." There was no surprise in her voice. "Only care?" She asked if I was sure, and I said yes, because certainty had finally replaced hope. She came that afternoon, documents in hand, and we sat at my kitchen table like we had so many times before. But this time the air was heavier. Final, she explained everything slowly, kindly, as if I were fragile glass. And when she asked who I wanted to leave my estate to, I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth is I didn't want to take something away from my son. I wanted to give something to meaning. And that's when I thought of the Harbour Light Home, a small foundation I volunteered at years ago. A place for elderly women abandoned quietly by families who didn't want to deal with inconvenience. Women whose children visited once a year out of obligation, if that. Women who smiled too quickly because they were grateful just to be acknowledged. I saw myself in them now, not because I lived there, but because I understood the feeling of being managed instead of loved. And when I said the foundation's name out loud, it felt right in a way nothing else had. Rhea looked at me carefully and said, "You know this means Elia will get nothing." And I nodded. Because I did know, and because for the first time, that knowledge didn't break me. We worked quietly, professionally, listing assets, clarifying instructions. And when the final document was ready, my hand shook as I signed it, not from doubt, but from the weight of choosing myself after a lifetime of choosing others. I asked Ria to hold on to it until after the wedding, not out of spite, but because I didn't want my decision to become a weapon before it became a boundary. She understood without explanation, as she always did, and when she left, the house felt different, not emptier, lighter, as if something unspoken had finally been said. That night I slept without dreaming of Elia for the first time since he was born. And that's when I knew the decision was final, because peace, when it comes, doesn't argue. I thought changing my will would be the hardest part. But the wedding invitation arrived next door, and it asked me to disappear politely. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon, slipped through the mail slot like an afterthought. Thick paper, elegant font, heavy with importance. And I knew before opening it that it wasn't sent with love. Because love doesn't hesitate, love doesn't need coaching. Love doesn't arrive days late pretending to be generous. I sat at the table for a long time just looking at the envelope. My name written carefully, formally, as if distance could be bridged with ink. And when I finally opened it, my hands were steady in a way that surprised me. Inside was a card announcing a new venue, a vineyard far from the city, surrounded by white flowers and curated beauty. And beneath the details was a smaller note, added like a footnote to my existence. You are welcome to attend and sit in the designated family section. Please respect the couple's wishes. And I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was honest. This was their compromise, their mercy. I was allowed to exist as long as I stayed controlled, quiet, contained. And I realized then that this invitation wasn't about reconciliation. It was about appearance, about easing guilt without changing behavior. And I didn't feel angry. I felt tired, tired of being managed, tired of being minimized, tired of shrinking myself to fit other people's comfort. I folded the invitation neatly and placed it beside my cup of tea. And for the rest of the afternoon, I moved through the house slowly, touching familiar things like I was saying goodbye to a version of myself. The woman who waited, who excused, who hoped too much. And that night, I made my decision. I would go, not to beg, not to be seen, not to disrupt, but to witness, to give myself the closure Elia would never offer. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of day people remember in photos, and I dressed carefully, not extravagantly, but with intention. A soft grey suit I had owned for years, pressed and clean. A deep blue scarf wrapped neatly around my head, pinned with a small silver brooch that had belonged to my mother. I looked at my reflection for a long moment, not searching for youth or approval, just truth. And what I saw was a woman who had survived more than anyone in that vineyard would ever know. Ria arrived to drive me, quiet and steady, carrying her briefcase like it held something sacred. And we didn't talk much on the drive. Words felt unnecessary. The vineyard was beautiful in a way that almost felt cruel, rows of green stretching into the distance. White chairs lined perfectly, guests laughing easily, dressed in colours chosen to match the scenery. And I noticed how no one looked at me twice, how I blended into the background exactly as intended. I took my seat in the third row, not the front, not the back, just far enough to be unimportant, and I sat with my hands folded in my lap, breathing slowly, watching my son from a distance. Elia looked confident, polished, happy even. And for a moment, my heart betrayed me, swelling with pride that had nowhere to go. I remembered the boy who slept in his shoes, the man who now stood so far away from me emotionally that the physical distance felt symbolic. Morabel walked down the aisle radiant, flawless, and the guests sighed appreciatively. Cameras lifted, music swelled, and I stayed still, present but invisible. The ceremony unfolded with words about family, about gratitude, about honouring those who raised you. And I wondered if Elia felt the irony of those sentences or if he had trained himself not to hear them. He didn't look at me once, not even by accident. And that hurt more than any speech ever could. When they were pronounced married and applause filled the air, I didn't stand, I didn't clap, I simply sat, absorbing the moment because I understood something then. This was not my loss, it was his, and when the guests began moving toward the reception, Ria leaned slightly toward me and asked quietly, "Are you ready?" And I nodded. Because readiness isn't confidence, it's acceptance. She stood and walked toward Elia with calm purpose, interrupting the chaos of congratulations with quiet authority. She handed him the envelope without ceremony and said, "This is from your mother," and before he could speak, she turned away and returned to me. I stood slowly, carefully, my body reminding me of its limits, and as I walked down the aisle between the chairs, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I felt the shift behind me, the confusion, the pause, the beginning of understanding, but that was no longer mine to carry. Outside, the air felt cooler, freer, and as we drove away, I watched the vineyard disappear in the distance, knowing that whatever was unfolding back there would unfold without me. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like relief. Not loss. I thought leaving the wedding would bring me peace. But what happened after he opened the envelope changed everything for all of us. I wasn't there when Elia opened the envelope. And that was intentional, because some truths don't need witnesses. They need space, but I felt the moment anyway. Felt it like a quiet shift in the air, the way you feel rain before it falls. Later, Ria told me how his smile faded as he read. How his shoulders stiffened as the words settled into him. How Maribel's impatience turned into confusion and then something sharper. Something fearful, because money has a way of revealing intentions faster than love ever does. Inside that envelope was no anger, no insults, just clarity. The legal document clean and undeniable, my estate reassigned, my future redirected. And a letter written in my hand, steady and calm, telling him that I loved him once without limits. But love without dignity eventually becomes self-erasure, and I would no longer erase myself for his comfort. Ria said he read it twice, like the meaning might change if he looked harder, like reality could be negotiated, and then the murmurs started around them. Guests sensing disruption the way crowds always do, leaning closer, whispering questions. Maribel demanding explanations in a voice too sharp for celebration. Her eyes darting across the venue as if searching for someone to blame. And Elia standing there, finally alone in a way he had never experienced before. Alone not because people weren't around him, but because no one was carrying him anymore. I was already home by then, sitting in my living room with the curtains half drawn, the kettle warming on the stove, and I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired, the good kind of tired, the kind that comes after a long truth has finally been spoken. My phone buzzed once, twice, then again, Elia's name lighting up the screen like a ghost. I didn't answer, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I had spent a lifetime answering immediately. And this time, I needed silence to do its work. The next message came from an unfamiliar number. Maribel's, short and sharp, asking what game I thought I was playing. And I set the phone face down because I wasn't playing anything. I was finishing something. That evening Ria came by. Not as a lawyer, not as an accomplice, but as a friend. We sat together without talking much, and she told me what happened after. How Maribel walked away mid-argument, heels sinking into grass she had chosen for beauty not balance. How Elia tried to follow her and then stopped, unsure which direction was still his. How the photographer quietly packed up, sensing the story had shifted, and as Ria spoke, I realized something gently devastating. My absence had spoken louder than my presence ever could. Later that night, alone again, I allowed myself to cry. Not for the wedding, not for the money. But for the boy I had raised, the boy who had learned too late that love doesn't wait forever, I cried for the years I made excuses, for the moments I saw fun truths to protect him. And when the tears passed, I felt something settle inside me. Acceptance, not the kind that gives up, but the kind that moves forward. The days that followed were quiet, my health still fragile, my body still limited, but my spirit lighter. I donated clothes, sorted papers, simplified my space like someone preparing for a journey. Elia called again, then sent messages longer this time. Apologetic, confused, asking to talk, and I read them slowly, carefully. Because remorse that arrives after consequences is complicated. It may be sincere, but it is no longer innocent. I didn't respond immediately, not because I wanted revenge, but because I was finally listening to myself, and what I heard was a need for peace. Not resolution. Weeks later, I received a letter, handwritten. From Elia, not typed, not filtered. Words uneven, vulnerable. He wrote about shock, about regret, about not realizing how far he had gone until the ground disappeared beneath him. And I believed him, I did, but belief doesn't undo damage. And love doesn't require self-betrayal. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not burned, not returned, just acknowledged. Because some relationships don't end in closure. They end in distance, and distance, when chosen, can be healing. I thought the story ended with the will, but the truth is, the hardest decision was still waiting for me. The decision I had been avoiding finally came to me one early morning when the house was still blue with dawn, when pain sat gently in my bones but didn't ask for attention, and I realized that healing doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like choosing a different ending. I made tea and sat by the window watching strangers begin their days. And I understood that my life did not end the moment my son chose image over intimacy. It simply changed direction. I didn't write Elia back right away, not because I hated him, but because love does not mean access without accountability. Weeks passed quietly. My health stabilized enough for me to breathe without fear. And during that time, I visited the Harbour Light home, not as a benefactor, but as a woman who understood. I sat with women who told stories no one else asked to hear, women whose children sent money instead of visits, whose lives had been reduced to summaries, and I saw myself not as a victim, but as a survivor who still had something to give. And when the foundation board asked why I chose them, I said simply, because they didn't ask me to disappear. News traveled quietly at first, then louder, about the donation, about the wedding, about the mother who walked away without raising her voice. People asked me if I felt victorious, if I felt satisfied, and I always said no. Because this was never about winning, it was about stopping the loss of myself. Months later, Elia came to see me unannounced. Standing at my door without confidence, without cologne, without performance. Just my son, tired and unsure, and I invited him in. Because boundaries don't require cruelty. We sat across from each other like strangers learning a shared language, and he apologized without excuses, without blaming anyone else, and I listened. Because listening does not mean erasing the past. It means acknowledging it. I told him I loved him, because that never stopped being true, and I told him I would not change my will, because that also was true. He cried quietly, not dramatically, and when he left, there was no promise of repair, only respect, and sometimes that is enough. Now, my days are smaller but fuller. I walk when I can, I rest when I need to, I drink tea without rushing. I no longer apologize for taking up space. My name now lives on a building meant to protect women like me, women who were told they were too much, too old, too inconvenient. And if Elia ever watches this, if he ever hears my voice telling this story, I want him to know this wasn't punishment. It was inheritance redirected toward truth. Because a mother's love is infinite, but her self-respect must be protected. And I finally learned that lesson late in life. But not too late. Never too late to choose dignity. Never too late to stop shrinking. And never too late to live the rest of your life without asking permission to exist. If you're watching this and you feel invisible, remember this: love should never require you to disappear, and it's never too late to choose yourself. I'm not telling this story to shame my son or to praise myself. I'm telling it because somewhere out there is another mother sitting quietly in a room that feels too small, wondering when love started asking her to disappear. And I want you to know this: giving birth does not mean giving up your worth. Raising someone does not mean shrinking yourself. And loving deeply does not require accepting cruelty politely. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ruin a wedding. I didn't take revenge. I simply chose dignity when silence became too expensive. And if my story stays with you, let it be this: you are allowed to take up space, even at the end of your life. Especially then.